Start with you, Steve. Tell us more about the Hunter Jobs Alliance.
Thank you, Luke. So I've been invited along tonight just to tell the story of the Hunter Jobs Alliance. Drew the short straw, I go first, and then Felicity comes in and cleans it all up afterwards. But I might kick off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet today. For me, I'm on Darug land, and I pay my respects to elders, leaders and warriors, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any First Nation people that are here with us tonight. For those that haven't met, I'm Steve Murphy. I'm the National Secretary of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, or as most people know it, the AMWU. And I became a rank and file activist with the AMWU when I was a young apprentice. And when I was raising issues about the conditions I was working under, I was taught by AMWU delegates how to fix the problems I had through organising and collective action. And AMWU delegates instilled in me pretty early that it was our duty as unionists to give workers the tools to recognise their own power, not to patronise them by serving the status quo or to tell them that things should be fine the way that they are. I became a rank and file delegate when I came out of my apprenticeship, working in the steel industry in Newcastle at a place called Tube Makers. It was a pretty good heartland to learn industrial relations, and it was a pretty militant site. There wasn't too many Fridays when I was an apprentice that the tradespeople didn't have boats hitched up to the back of their cars ready for the boss to do something on a Friday that would allow them to go fishing. So we stood our ground on relation to a number of things. And eventually, due to a short-term vacancy that needed to be filled in our union's Newcastle office, I was asked to fill as an organiser just a short-term period of delegation. And 17 years later, having moved through organising and to the leadership of the New South Wales branch, now appointed as the National Secretary of our union. And it's really great to be here tonight with the Search Foundation talking about our newly formed Hunter Jobs Alliance. When I say ours, it's AMWU and Lean, but we'll get into the other organisations that have helped us to pull this together. Activists and thinkers from Search have been a constant source of learning for me and for the AMWU over my time in the union movement. And it was actually a collaboration between Search and the AMWU that formed the genesis for the Hunter Jobs Alliance, which I'll get to that part very, very shortly. So the Hunter Jobs Alliance, or the HJA as we kind of affectionately call it nowadays because we say it so often, comprises 13 member-based organisations local to the Hunter Valley. It includes trade unions like the AMWU, of course, but the ETU, the Teachers Union, the Nurses and Midwives, the United Workers Union, the ASU, the CPSU, the IEU and the NTU. But there are a number of other unions now that are expressing a view that they want to be part of it. And the Alliance brings together local environmental and community advocacy groups as well. And Felicity will cover a lot of this in detail, but the work that we've done with Lean and with Hunter Renewal, the Hunter Community Environment Centre and the National Conservation Council has just been incredible. And again, but there are many more expressing interest that they would like to be involved in what we're doing as well. And while we're in the early stages of our alliance, our aims in our little small corner of the world is to end the climate culture wars. But they've not only arrested action on climate change for well over a decade, but have isolated an entire cohort of working class people who just feel like they're backed into a corner by an often cruel and impersonal debate about the future of their livelihoods. And we're prosecuting a case now that just says we can have both climate action and job creation. And you'll hear us say that continually for the next couple of years. We can have both climate action and job creation. And for our union, this began probably in the aftermath of the 2019 federal election. I mean, we know too well the way that the Conservatives in our parliament and media have weaponised these debates to silo progressive groups and push us to fight with each other instead of fighting with them. And I've mentioned many times about the Queensland example in Clermont in having these conversations, as it's a perfect example of the culmination of decades of letting conservative forces frame and shape our activism around this and many other issues. And that moment where you see working people, often in union t-shirts, throwing rocks at a convoy of Bob Brown supporters in central Queensland, you know that we can no longer continue to just stand in our silos and hope that this issue will fix ourselves. For many of us, we knew that we could no longer ignore the problem or bury our heads in the sand as well. So this issue was and is too important to be left up to political parties to chase an imaginary centre or to wait for big business who just want to chase increasingly obscene profits and have working people be the collateral damage after they've finished squeezing us dry like a lemon. The issue, of course, has to be rooted in the local and led by those who stand to lose the most, and that is working class people. And it's got to be based in the community with consensus, and it can't avoid the heart of the problem that we are facing. So we started where we should always start as a union. That's in our workplaces, talking to our members and talking to our delegates. And together with the Search Foundation, we put together a delegate and activist education program. Really, it was around the core elements of left-wing thinking about feminism and socialism through to radical justice, Indigenous rights and the environment. And we gathered around 30 of our rank and file delegates to have a bit of a discussion on, and officials, of course, on a Saturday. And we made it a full day of socialist education with some of the best thinkers from around our movement. And, you know, Luke helped to bring that together for us. So thank you very much, Luke, again. And for that session on the environment, we had Felicity Wade come along and give us a presentation. And I didn't know Felicity prior to that day. And, you know, in my experience in dealing with environmentalists when I was an organizer up in the valley, you know, I always kind of had this impression or experience that they were almost tone deaf to workers' concerns, often through an unsympathetic lens. And I also knew that we had a number of delegates in the room from the heart of the Hunter Valley that probably had the same experience, but who had fed and housed their family on the supply chain of the coal industry or the energy industry for decades. And to be honest, I didn't know what was going to happen, but we had good people in the room that were respectful. And for anyone who has ever been to an AMWU meeting of our delegates, and there's a couple on the hookup tonight, they're no shrinking violets, and they're not afraid to speak their minds, no matter what title people have. And I still have that as a National Secretary, constantly reminded where I came from and who I'm there to represent. But Felicity for us was extremely refreshing for our rank and file delegates. She spoke about the history of the environmental movement and really piqued our interest when she started to talk about the BLF's green bans and that history of working people working together across a whole movement. And in one fell swoop, Felicity demonstrated that militant and blue collar parts of our movement were able to break out of the boxes that we were told that we should fit into because of our occupations and show leadership on behalf of our whole communities. And, you know, one thing that me and Felicity still do disagree on, and that is who actually said this first. I reckon it was her, but it's a sentence that diagnosed the worry and all of the feeling that we have, but we find hard to articulate. And that is, when workers' politics are ahead of environmental politics, then we will win. And one of our supply chain delegates spoke up at that point and said, it's not coal that we're loyal to, it's our families and good jobs. And if we could shift tomorrow, we would. So the next week, myself and Felicity caught up and we sat down and had a cup of coffee. And we decided that we both hate this climate culture war that continues to drag and hold both of our respective organisations back, and both resent the lack of courage and honesty that centre-left parties have shown for far too long, particularly when they're talking to workers in coal communities. We also agreed that the politics of polarisation, while, you know, it has its place, we're not going to serve our communities already facing an uncertain future. Eventually, we started to talk to other trade unionists, community leaders and environmental campaigners across the Hunter from our respective, you know, people that we normally talk to. And we found that there was a general consensus that we had a responsibility to act. And that even though it would be difficult, the threat of the social dislocation and the economic disempowerment, if we did nothing, would be absolutely disastrous for workers and families all across the Hunter, and disastrous for those people that care about the environment in which they live. So as part of my work figuring out where our union was going to land on this issue, I visited numerous workplaces all across the Hunter, focusing particularly on those workplaces that service all different parts of the mining industry, from manufacturing the vehicles to servicing on site to maintaining the trains or even maintaining the coal loaders. And our organisers were a bit nervous about it, is the truth, on how that would be received. But while I was sympathetic to that concern, beyond the traditional conservative rhetoric that unions should stick to wages and conditions, I know that workers are worried. And given the way that this debate has been framed for so long, you know, workers were probably going to argue that we were out for their jobs. So we thought carefully about how we should talk about that. And by the end, found out that there were three things that really worked. The first one was rejecting the framing set up by the conservative politicians and media. We were not there to discuss the merits or drawbacks of climate science. We were there to talk about their industry, their future, their family, and what they wanted a union that was going to be looking after their future should do. Secondly, we needed to accurately diagnose what the problem was. Now, workers told me that they knew it wasn't really greenies who were taking their jobs, but it was the only narrative that they could use to defend their jobs because they felt like they were on an all-out attack from everybody. And when we explicitly rejected this jobs versus the environment frame and reframed it to capitalists will always make decisions in the pursuit of profit with no regard for workers, it makes so much more sense with their actual lived experience. And we know that something's going on, and we don't trust political parties or mining bosses to fix the problem. And thirdly, it was about trust and familiarity. And at almost every single workshop that I went to, I ran into somebody that I did my apprenticeship with, or that I grew up with, or I played in a band with, or I even organised them into the union when I was an organiser in the Hunter Valley. They knew me, and they knew I was one of them. And the hyper-local approach that we took and the honest diagnosis of the problem meant that we met with well over 600 workers all across the valley, and only had one of them tell me that I was a greenie. So after we got those meetings underway, I found that our members were actually excited about what the possibilities were for investment in their futures. The enthusiasm kind of gave me the license to start to bring our efforts together into something more collective and more formal. And we've been working for over 10 months now, and we've only just got to the point now where everybody's kind of seen we've done the public-facing launch of the HJA. Amongst all the other challenges setting up an organisation poses, it made it all the more challenging when you're coming together with people that you're told that you can't trust them and that you should hate them. And for anyone who's experienced working across both the working workers and union movement and across environmental politics, you know that there can be vast differences in our organisational structure and our organising practice. And neither's right or wrong, but finding a way through that has been one of the many challenges that myself and Felicity have had to kind of sit down with and navigate through and make sure that we landed in the best interest of both of our respective membership. And it's been a welcoming challenge, and one that's benefit of lifting ourselves out of our silos and the opportunity to learn from each other about our respective strengths. So now we've got this shared vision, an endorsed constitution, an online presence, a membership system, and as of yesterday, it looks like we've found a paid coordinator to hit the ground running and do some of the work to free myself and Felicity up to focus on our other jobs. So this is looking really, really positive. And our job now is to harness the vast community reach of our organisations have and turn that into political will for investment in future industries. And we're working to think outside the box, from things like housing retrofits to offshore wind farms and reusing coal ash for manufacturing. But we're also thinking bigger about how we bring manufacturing supply chains back on shore, how we can become a renewable energy exporter, and our public ownership of our energy assets. And the difference between having a job and having a good job has always been making sure that you got a strong union. And that's why workers all across the supply chain of the coal and energy industries have enjoyed good jobs for generations. And it's also why the new industries that are popping up are being so widely exploitative. And for us, community can demand and win jobs in new industries, but it's up to unions working together with the environmental movement to make sure that we turn any transition that is happening in our economy into good jobs for working class people moving forward. So we're at the stage now where private capital and government are actually asking us instead of to grab a seat at the table with them, instead of building our own table, which we were prepared to do if it came to it. And this to me is encouraging, not because I've got an interest in sitting across the table from bosses and bureaucrats, but because many of them, because for many of them, the cover that they've been hiding under, where they've advocated for their own interests over working people in the dark, is slowly being pulled back by the Hunter Jobs Alliance being formed. And the big takeaway for me this year has been the value and importance of walking towards discomfort. And our organising team on the HJA, we sat in that discomfort for almost a year, where we waded through tedious questions to land a structure that would work for us. And while at times it can be exhausting, that's where change really happens, and that's where people shift. And I know many of us here are grappling with these important issues through our lenses of our occupations or our respective passions. So whether it's preserving the environment, action on climate change, economic justice, or you just believe in workers' rights, you know, I'm looking forward to working with you. So thank you, Luke, and of course a big thank you to Felicity for her work on this as well.
Thank you, Steve. I think everyone's clapping in their various locations, and I think we've everyone on the line heard me introduce Felicity, so I should just go straight to you, comrade. Unless for any reason I need to ask you to unmute.
Unmute. Yeah, there I am. I am unmuted. Thank you, Steve. As Steve said, we have sort of had this shtick where I come in behind and try and fill in all the gaps, but I think he's pretty much covered it. But first of all, of course, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land and I'm on Gadigal land. And as an environmentalist, I always at these moments think about what an amazing place Enmore must have been when the white fellas invaded. It would have been an amazing bit of bush, so temperate and so rich, and acknowledge Aboriginal people and their leadership. I also want to acknowledge all of, it's amazing looking at this, there's comrades across the country that some of you I only know by social media, some of you I've worked with in all sorts of different ways, so it's great to see you. And of course, I also want to acknowledge Adam Searle, who is the Shadow Minister in New South Wales for climate change, who's been a huge supporter of Hunter Jobs Alliance and a huge supporter of our work in Lean. I think most of you probably know what Lean fundamentally is. It's the Labour Environment Action Network. We are a group of Labour rank and file that campaign for better policy from the Labor Party. But I guess also beyond campaigning for better policy, which we've had quite a lot of success with, we really aim to get Labor to the point where environment is in its DNA. Or it's sort of a core task, a core business of the Labor Party. And I'd argue that we're still struggling with that. And I think probably it's the jobs versus environment, dichotomy that continues to trip us up. And I think until we get past that, until we build, as Steve said, a genuine labour version of climate change politics, we will continue to struggle. And that's why I guess that sort of idea of us entrenching ourselves in the heart of the party, and a sort of social democratic party of the 21st century can't afford not to, I don't think. And I think we've still got work to go on that, not to just be responding to external forces, but to have that sort of grounded in the heart of the party so that we can more confidently manage what this debate that still trips us up. And as Steve said, the culture war, after 2019, the election, we were pretty devastated. The culture war had been so effectively used to undermine action on climate and undermine workers' confidence in our ability to move through that well. And I guess I felt it very keenly because I think the movement from which I'm part of has been a very powerful and unwitting pawn in that culture war that has served the interests who don't want climate action so well. And as I sit in Labor, I kind of, I have this now kind of schizophrenic kind of life, but I felt like, as a Labor environmentalist, we really had to do something to try and address that, even if those around us potentially weren't going to, anyway, you all know some of the contours of how those interests for whom the culture war serves so well managed to use both of our sides of both our movements in conflict in 2019. I guess the only thing I wanted to say, the things I'd add to what Steve said is we know that the ANU electoral study was very clear. It's written every federal election. There's a very comprehensive survey of what happened in terms of how people voted. And in 2019, it's very clear that Labor did very well out of climate and environment policy generally. However, the other side did very well out of leadership, out of economics, and out of taxation. Now, leadership and taxation was probably our problem, but the economic, people going to the coalition on economics, and ANU study basically says a lot of people came to Labor on the issue of environment and climate, but more people went to the opposition, the other side on those other issues. But, you know, our stance on climate change not only hit us very, very hard in coal-affected communities, and arguably there's about 10 of them, 10 electorates around the country for whom coal is a really significant issue, employer. The way that goes is Labor used to hold 8 of them, it now holds 5. And to get a left-wing party of government up, we're going to have to, we can't really lose any more of them. But more importantly, beyond the coal communities, it also obviously impacted in places like WA and Queensland, where people are even in the south east of Queensland, in places like Ford or Petrie, you know, they know that that state is dependent on mining, and so the sort of the sense that coal workers were under threat sort of impacted their sense that people weren't looking after them. So, you know, I guess that's the challenge we have to, you know, we need to address. You know, we're not, this is something that will stop, that is toxic for climate politics. And of course, you know, because I guess fundamentally, as you know, both the Labor movement and the environment movement so believe in the power of people to make change. You know, that's what we share. We had on Monday night, we had our first activist meeting where all of the groups involved in Hunter Jobs Alliance invited their membership to sit down in a big Zoom meeting. We had 85 people online, and it was fantastic. They were all people from the Hunter, and I had a breakout group which was genuinely, you know, AMWU delegates who are were on their lunch break in high vis with their safety glasses on. They were science teachers in Muswellbrook, retired science teachers in Muswellbrook. They were Labor Party members who worked for Hunter Water. They were, you know, they were whole, and they were old greenies that I've known for a million years that I could hardly remember existed, but still working away in the Hunter. So, you know, it was a genuine bringing together of the two constituencies we represent and we seek to you know, galvanise. So that was pretty exciting. As Steve said, fundamentally, we are really hoping, you know, from my point of view as a Labor Party person, we know that our party used to be, in the 1890s, you know, when we were invented, our movement and our party specifically were incredibly grounded in our communities. You know, we used to do the things that the state didn't do, which, you know, as you know, there's a sort of victim of our own success challenge in all of that. But, you know, I often talk about, I have this letter that my grandmother got when my grandfather died, which was the widow's payment from his union. You know, that way that we were so important in communities. And it's part of that legacy we want to recapture in terms of our work in the Hunter. We want to do 2 things, as Steve, I think, alluded to. We want to start talking about real projects in real places that people can believe in. We want to build the social license for real things. Whether that's, you know, retooling Tomago, you know, with renewables, whether it's, you know, recycling fly ash out of and making tiles and so on, whether it's rehabilitating mine sites. There's all these ways that we can, you know, very, very practical things that we can bring to the Hunter. So we want to talk about those things and then talk about them, build the social license from the community, hopefully get the community starting to believe that there are alternatives. And as we do that, build the political capital to ensure that governments come to the party and sort of delivering, making those things real. So we really want to actually be out there talking about real stuff. But as Steve also said, we know that this is bigger than any of us, and we are already having conversations, a whole bunch of the other interests that are floating around concerned about transition in the Hunter. But we really want a table. We want a table, which is a, you know, a sort of a negotiated space. And of course, fundamentally, we not only want a table, but more importantly, we want to be at the table. So, you know, I guess our original idea was we want to be at the table, but we also now we actually have to create that table. And eventually, of course, that is going to need serious state support. This isn't possible without government investment and support to make that happen. So that's kind of where we're sort of the big projects we're sort of heading towards. As Steve said, it's been a slow journey, but we are day by day getting there, and with huge enthusiasm from across. We've been amazed by the enthusiasm. I mean, this is a story. This is a project people want to, you know, we all know we want to believe in it. So and we'll just take one day at a time. and hopefully work out how best to work together, how best to impact the debate, how best to make sure that we are effective in making sure that those communities that have powered the country, who are proud of having powered the country, do not pay like we've seen so many times. I mean, you know, it is the politics that power Brexit and Trump, where these communities know who's paid in terms of the economic transitions of the last 25 or 30 years. In neoliberal transitions, those communities, the working communities pay the price, and we really want to stand in between the inevitable change that is coming in those communities and make sure that that's not the case. That's it for me.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. We've got a million questions coming in, and some of them are really, you know, straight to the hard questions. And I think, you know, you wouldn't expect anything less from the audience that we've got on the line here tonight. A bit of a theme is a question which Paul Norton from Brisbane, former search returning officer, has asked. I've seen it argued that it will be difficult to provide transitions away from coal that will ensure that coal industry workers are re-employed in new jobs as remunerative as their existing jobs. $1 million question, is this the case? And if so, how can this be addressed? And a similar question from Jafar Kazmi, what are the comparable jobs? So what are the specific roles and locational specific jobs that pay as well as coal jobs? So for both of you, maybe Felicity, you want to go, either of you go first, who wants to take it? Sorry, comrade, I'll just make sure you can talk. The vagaries of Zoom, but
there we go. Hey, Steve, I reckon you should answer that in terms of how those jobs got to be so well paid and so on.
Yeah, I'm happy to cover that. I think there's probably three parts to it, really. One is that, you know, we've had more than a decade of climate culture wars, where politicians and miner bosses have created conflicts between workers and the environmental movement for their own benefit. Workers know that our energy needs are changing. There's no surprise about that. They're worried about the future and the kind of, not necessarily their job, but certainly the kind of jobs that their kids are going to have and whether or not they're going to move away. And the difference, as I said before, between, you know, just having a job and having a good job is having a strong union. And this is a time for the government to put aside the ideology, to work with communities to build a real plan for decent jobs and a healthy future. You know, shifting large workforces in industries takes a lot of time. And we know that private enterprise, private capital is not up for that challenge, and they're not up for the planning. And it'll be devastating to communities if we just leave it like we did with BHP, like we did to the car industry, like we did with all the component sectors. So that is why we actually need a statutory authority set up, one that's independent, one that will be tripartite, one that will be working with affected workers and their communities at the centre, hyper-local in regional areas, ready to roll their sleeves up and deliver a plan for our future that puts workers at front and centre, but also takes into consideration not just the blue and white collar jobs that come from this, but start to think about what are the things that communities actually need to thrive and survive, making sure we've got all of those support services in, making sure that all of the jobs were created. And you know, one of the things we're thinking about is there's going to be lots of jobs in the caring industry. We need to fix those jobs up and make sure that they're decent paid as well. There's a long history behind that, and you know that we need wage justice as part of any transition, because while it might be, you know, coal and power stations at the moment, there's going to be a whole host of our industries that will go through a transition, and workers going through transition as their careers and the skill needs change. So yeah, we need a transition authority that's ready to roll their sleeves up to get into this.
That goes to a question that Greg Giles, who's from the Hunter, asked actually about, have you had any contact with the local councils? How can they help? Can they participate directly in the Hunter Jobs Alliance?
Do you want me to take that one initially?
And maybe
yes.
just while you're at it, Felicity, as well as Leonie Ebert asked for some of the community organisations that have joined in too.
Yeah, sure. So on the councils, there's 10 councils across the Hunter have actually joined together to create a joint organisation, and that is one of the powerful kind of backbones of the transition conversation that's occurring already in the Hunter. They have a guy who runs that, and they're really working together to try and build a foundation, try and build a sort of a base of investment to actually start being able to act in the world on this stuff. So we expect to work quite closely with them. As far as individual councils, we actually have spent quite a lot of time talking to elected officials in the councils across the region. So many of them are actually doing fantastic work. It's very interesting, of course, you know, there is probably a gap in terms of how they talk about their work and how what they're doing. Martin Rush in Muswellbrook has done huge amounts of work in terms of preparing his community. They have done, you know, incredibly innovative things. They've actually got an old mine site, and they've managed to they did the study, the sort of impact, the feasibility study, and actually connected the mine site to a piece of council land uphill from the mine site, and have put it all together and sold it to AGL as a pumped hydro site. I mean, incredibly kind of proactive in providing alternatives. So they're doing all sorts of interesting things. We also, of course, have had a lot to do with Newcastle Council. The Deputy Mayor there was a founding New South Wales Lean convener. And just last week, the council passed a motion in support of Hunter Jobs Alliance and asking to actually build a formal alliance with us. So that's really exciting. So yeah, look, we're talking to all of those different the councils, and I think probably, I mean, it'll be interesting as we continue to try and build the best model for what a transition authority should do. But I think the councils in a place like the Hunter are incredibly powerful in terms of making it genuinely regional and genuinely locally led. Of course, I think we probably have seen some fairly some mistakes in terms of sort of attempts on this stuff with kind of being quite too sort of central statist kind of in the approaches. In terms of the community groups involved, the Nature Conservation Council, which is the New South Wales Environment group that has the membership of all the small environment organisations around the state, is a founding member. The Hunter Community Environment Centre is also a founding member, and they actually and they work very closely with a group called the Hunter Renewal. Hunter Renewal is, I think, effectively a spin-off of the Lock the Gate, and Hunter Renewal have been doing great work of trying to actually start doing some of these conversations in the Hunter. But again, of course, it's very exciting for, you know, their skills and what they've done to come together with us, because in a sense, there's a messenger issue for them really getting to talk to impacted people. So I think that's formally, have I missed anyone, Steve? I think that's the three formally involved. Look, and again, we know it's going to be a question, because as Steve has said, we've got huge amounts of interest, and I'm not quite sure how we grow in a way that keeps workers and working class politics at its centre, while also, you know, really embracing the sort of enthusiasm across the community.
That's good. On that theme, we have a question from Bart Steinman. I'll just get you up, unmute you, so you can ask it yourself, which goes to on a similar theme as that. We got you there, Bart?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Great. G'day, thank you so much. Hi, Felicity. Hi, Steve. My question was, you know, how can people based in capital cities, I mean, I'm in Sydney, Darlington, you know, acknowledging our own kind of disconnection from a lot of these things taking place, what's the best way for us to contribute to efforts like the Hunter Jobs Alliance, but I guess just more broadly, this type of organising, yeah, from afar? Thanks.
I finally unmuted. I was hoping Steve might answer that.
I'm not sure he's unmuted too.
If you can't get off, have a go.
I would say that there's a couple of things you can do. Firstly is if you're working in any industries of the unions that I mentioned before, join one of them. If you're not working in those industries, urge your union to participate. And of course, you can become a member of Lean as well, and get involved. Like the Hunter is the pilot, is the truth. The Hunter Jobs Alliance is the first one. There's going to be a whole lot more areas around Australia for people, you know, who are going through a transition, or for people who are interested in being involved in a joint initiative that puts working people at the centre. Our initial thoughts were the Hunter Jobs Alliance is that we want to fill it with people who are local, that are going to be able to have those conversations and really be able to put their shoulder to the wheel to make things happen. We haven't thought too much about, you know, supporters, et cetera, but it's something that we should probably put some thinking to get the Hunter Jobs Alliance to support that it needs to be successful.
Yeah, I just add, yeah, it's a good question, Bart. We should, yeah, as Steve said, think about that, how people can effectively support communities.
I would first of all also just add that make sure you check out the Hunter Jobs Alliance website and their Facebook page, and you know, familiarise yourself with their aims and get to know more about it. I've got a question about a you know, very topical thing from Zach Gillies Palmer. I'll just make sure he's unmuted. Can you hear us? Yeah, there you go, Zach. Ask yourself, mate.
Oh, hey. Yeah, thanks for putting this together. This has been a really great project, and I think, you know, it really is the only way forward that I can see. So kudos to the medals and for Felicity and Lean for putting it together. My question is, you know, there seems to be a really significant contradiction in the federal government's policy. You know, it's obviously trying to bolster a lot of the large coal companies at the expense of workers, but it's also engaged in this very acrimonious fight with the, you know, Chinese government. And I was wondering, to what extent is the fact that China is seemingly boycotting coal imports and, you know, the possible ramifications that could have in the industry, how's that being registered on the ground in the Hunter? Because I mean, it seems to me that could really expedite a neoliberal and a very unjust transition away from coal. And I wondered, I guess, if that's sort of weighing on people's minds.
Short version of that is, yes, it is. Of course it is. And that's one of the things that I think everybody's watching very closely. And it's one of the problems when you've got someone who's a marketing guy suddenly having to be a diplomat and not up to it. And I think at every single stage, our Prime Minister, when tested, not up to it, unless there's a marketing line or a way to spin it, and doesn't appreciate, and he's got no sympathy because he's never had to get his hands dirty on how this impacts on working class people. You know, we've seen ham-fisted approaches to every single thing that's affected that industry and many of others. There's significant investment, if it's available, that could have been given to our energy security, but failed. Like the half-baked idea about a gas-led recovery, which was part of a budget for big business. You know, $22 billion for the gas industry that creates no real jobs. It won't fix unemployment crisis. It won't lower power prices. It won't solve the climate crisis. And they earmark $1.5 billion for manufacturing over a number of years, where a manufacturing business has to put up $300,000 in order to get a go, which just means no one will be able to get up because they're all struggling on their knees. What we actually need is a broader vision for how we're going to recover from this post-COVID world. And rather than picking fights with countries that they are just out of their depth on, really as a distraction, need to focus on how they're going to pull us out. And in the absence of leadership from the federal government, of course, we've got the local councils that are doing some work, but it's worthwhile kind of recognising stuff that's happening at a state level in New South Wales at a time when, we've got a whole host of things are coming together with the environmental movement and the union movement, recognising that there's something going on. We saw just recently in our parliament some legislation pass where people got on a unity ticket and said this is in the best interests of the state. And we had Labor and the government working together to make sure that it was improved and it was going to have what were they called, renewable energy zones earmarked in the Hunter as well that were left off the list. That gives us an opportunity to do that. You know, Mark Latham trying to get the AMWU taken off the board that's going to oversee it because he doesn't like our work with lean. Well, fuck him. Labor and the Libs defended us and said we've got a right to be at the table as much as everyone else because our members are affected. Like there are organisations that you wouldn't expect now that are pulling together, recognising there's a legitimate problem. There just seems to be one organisation at a national level that is just, again, not up to the task. So yeah, good question, Zach.
Did you want to add anything to that, Felicity, or move on to the next question?
Yeah, that's great.
That's on that broad question. We have a question from Don Sutherland, former AMWU official himself. How does this project and its spreading relate to members of the Greens who would also support it? And I know that we've got a co-convener of the South Australian Greens on the line, another being a search event. There's lots of Greens members and supporters who would also support it. And Don points out, especially given that their position on workers' rights is better than Labor's. Some people might contest that, but many wouldn't. So how does this is, we're quite Labor Party focused here. How does it relate to Greens who would support this project?
I think I should probably answer that. Being the only organisation involved in the Hunter Jobs Alliance that is actually party aligned. Look, an interesting task, an interesting issue, because when Lean and Steve and AMW started the conversation, I was thinking, oh well, what was very instructive, which I thought was fantastic experience and affirming, was that Lean actually was a really valuable bridge in that conversation. That there was, we have deep connections in both the union movement, but also the environment movement, and that sort of brokering the conversation was actually a genuine task. Introducing, some of those sort of extra enviro kind of organisations like BZE to the AMWU, and bringing AIFA in to have the conversation, who do work on Tomago, and just actually both of us bringing things to each other that we didn't have. And sort of sitting in between that. I guess when it came to actually launching HJA, there was an argument, well, and some of the Green groups, of course, brought this up, well, you're partisan, and I thought we sort of had a bit of a moment about that in Lean and said, oh, well, then do we just, gracefully remove ourselves? But it's like, no, we are activists who are, left-wing activists who care about the environment, and the fact that we choose to do our efforts within the Labor Party is a strategic choice about needing a party of government to have strong bona fides on this issue. And I don't know why we should be written out of the story. So people have been generous in managing that. So that's really, where the history sits. In terms of the Greens and their involvement, of course, a number of the people who joined us the other night were from, were Greens party aligned, and that will of course happen. I would say, regardless of formal policy, very strong, in terms of the problems of the culture war, I think the Greens party has to take some fairly major responsibility, as you know. And so sort of a formal kind of, oh, we've got a better policy, may have to sit against, the most famous and successful leader being kind of actually doing the pin-up moment of culture war, cultural hysteria in the last election, and they're continuing, and in continuing in terms of, where we've got inner city versus regional communities, where we've got a party that, totally is playing to, whose constituency are the very people for whom, who are one side of the culture war. We just have to and I think this is one of the really interesting things that's happening in Hunter Jobs Alliance. We're starting to have this difficult conversation. And it's really, really interesting. There's a proposed action in the coal port in December, and we're just starting to have that conversation about, well, is that a really great thing to do? Is that, people have a right to non-violent action, but are we actually telling do these communities hear this as you are attacking us? And if that's the case, is it self-actualization to say I deserve to to protest against the coal port, or is it effective political action, or is it actually detrimental to our shared goals? And that's a really, really interesting conversation. You know, I come from the Wilderness Society. I've locked onto more trees than most, and cause, you know, in that last great culture war of the forestry campaigns. But I think it's a really, you know, we all have to ask those questions of ourselves now.
So I guess from my perspective, you know, one of the things we've found is when you don't care who gets the credit, it's amazing what you can achieve. And the only thing that is going to rescue us from the political quicksand that we've let ourselves fall into on this question is for all of us to keep pushing for ongoing discussions and continue to explore the tensions around these issues. And we've got so much more to do to end the climate culture wars, but I just come back to my saying, we'll work with anybody. But as long as we can put aside that issue, as long as we don't care who gets the credit, if it's not about that, happy to work with you because, you know, we can accomplish a lot.
That's my motto, Steve. That's my favourite line of all time. You may as well do too if you don't get credit. Just a comment, really, I think from Liz Folkart says, can Steve and Felicity, I think by that she means all of us, get this very informative information out to all branches. I'm not sure which branches she means, maybe Union or Labor Party, maybe Friends branches, I'm not sure. As we all have some senior retired union members mixed with members passionate about the environment. And I think that might be one for all of us to take on the responsibility for. Thanks for the reminder, Liz. I had a question from James Supple. He says, very much agree with Felicity, I'm sure Steve, that government investment is going to be necessary to get projects actually built, especially in the areas where existing coal jobs are. Are there specific projects you will be campaigning government or others to fund, or what approach do you think you're likely to take? You go, Steve, you're on screen.
Felicity had an answer.
Oh, sorry.
I was just asking if you want to answer it.
Oh, of course, there's unlimited projects that we can engage in. You know, if you think about what we were exposed to during COVID, those three things that sit in our memories more than anything, the long unemployment lines, think about the supermarket shelves that were empty for so long, and, you know, all of those people who are on the front lines in our healthcare system having to make their own PPE. But there is no shortage of opportunities about the new jobs that we could create in order to give people a decent way to make a living and to make sure that we've got the things that we need to thrive as a country. Part of the advocacy work we're doing is to be able to transition away from using fossil fuels to using different forms of energy. And we've kind of earmarked electric buses being an opportunity to, you know, onshore again our rail manufacturing, to think about the infrastructure needs that we need in the future and to build those here. Think about turning mining machinery from being diesel power into electric power and make them more safe to operate in there. And there's a few trials happening around that, to use the waste from these mine sites to go into manufacturing products, to rehabilitate the mine sites and go to different forms of, you know, energy out of growing crops on them as well. There's the rehabilitation, there's forestry jobs, there is recycling jobs. The list is endless. As long as you sit down with a pen and paper, you can write your own list about the kind of jobs when you've got a little bit of vision. And you just kind of got to wonder with these politicians, with all the time they've got down in Canberra, why they haven't sat down and made a list of their own about the kinds of jobs that we could go into these communities and share with workers and get their feedback on the ones that they think have got a bit of dignity and respect about and would like to transition to. There's no reason we can't build universities or hospitals or new schools. Like, the list goes on. And I just think that, you know, we just need some new governments at a federal and a state level that have got a bit of vision and got a bit of heart and prepared to roll their sleeves up. And then, you know, it's all ours.
And I'd just add to that from Steve too, is that there are a lot of really interesting, there is lots of interesting work going on in the Hunter, from everyone from the port to the university to the joint organisations of councils to there's a sort of business forum as well, and they are doing work and having, you know, and having ideas. And I guess in terms of, we would really love to get to the point where we can actually champion some specific things. But again, it's part of that thing about having a table. We really want to, you know, get the best advice and be very clear in terms of how we, you know, what we really champion, so that it's both can both fulfill our aims as well as be a really viable kind of commercial option.
The time has just raced away from us. It's unbelievable. Thank you for all the questions. I've got one last question here from John Wishart before we play our song and let people post anything they like in the chat, send messages to Felicity and Steve. So go ahead, John from South Australia.
Hi, thanks Luke, and thanks Felicity and Steve. My question is really about how the HCAA has been going in building support amongst ALP branch members in the Hunter, and I agree very much with the sentiment that we need to find common ground across the parties and also across the unions and community to push forward the direction we want. But specifically, given the nature of the Hunter and the sort of role of some important ALP figures there, how are you going on that, or what are your plans?
You're on mute, Steve. Yeah, look, on that, obviously, what Lean does, and very consciously does, is we organise rank and file. This came partially out of our when we reformed ourselves, in that we had no other tools. We had no one who wanted to talk to us. We had no institutions as part of the party who cared about our existence. So we said, okay, well, in the absence of anything else, we'll go and organise the rank and file. And that has become actually central to our actual mission. We see ourselves not only about pushing good environment policy, but actually empowering the sort of the people, and especially the branches. There's sort of 600 or 700 people, 700 branches that still exist across Australia, where people turn up to these tedious meetings month to month just because they want to make the world a better place. Like, it is amazing that that infrastructure still exists, and we're overtly there to give those people power. So we have, we're talking very much, as you say, there's a lot of Labor Party members in terms of the political system up there. We are encouraging them to increase, to sort of take some leadership. I think there's probably an argument that a little bit more political leadership is important. And we are certainly, in our big activist meeting on last Monday, we invited all the rank and file to join us, and of course many of them did. So look, I guess that's the sort of short answer, John. And but yeah, I totally agree. I think actually one of the things Hunter Jobs Alliance wants to do is, again, in a non-partisan way, support the political leadership in the region to, to be part of properly engaging with the community in terms of building a genuinely shared consensus approach.
I can probably supplement by saying that I'm a member of the Maitland branch, and Jenny Aitchison, the local member, even advertised tonight's event, sent it out to Labor Party members all across. We've had really positive responses from Sharon Clayton at a federal level, and Kate Washington at a state level as well. Like, there's no shortage of Labor Party members, other than the member from the Hunter who's up for the conversation and having the difficult, uncomfortable conversations that we need to as we transition from one to the other. The other thing we should mention, of course, is that Adam Searle, who's on tonight, has done, some really good work in this space. I'm talking with myself and Felicity in the lead up to that legislation going through the upper house, but working with us to make sure that conversation happens inside Labor. So yeah, some good people having good conversations. It's been really positive.
Well, it's great to hear. As I said, this has gone we've just raced through it. It feels like an hour is barely enough. Everyone's can now chat openly in the chat section, but I'm acutely aware Feeder's got their event on at 7, and they are our comrades, and we absolutely support their work, so we want to let them get to it. I want to thank Steve and Felicity. I want to thank all the people who've turned up and asked the questions. Look, Steve and Felicity are not hard to get to. If you've got a point you want to make to either of them, they're not in an ivory tower. You can get Steve on Twitter. You can catch Felicity via, various methods, social media and all the rest of it. If you really want to talk to her, send me an email, and I'm sure I can link you up. I've posted the link for Hunter Jobs Alliance there. They've got a Facebook page. We've had a discussion with Alex Cassie from WA about a similar project they're doing over there, so we might do a Zoom forum on that too. But most of all, I really want to thank Steve Murphy and Felicity Wade for being with us tonight. You're absolute legends. Thank you so much. And now we'll